Back, Richard. How you doing, my friend?
Hey Al, I am thrilled to be here today.
Hey, I'm thrilled that you're here. I mean, you wrote this article about a month ago, and I was really taken by it for a host of reasons. Number one, we've talked about systematic thinking and people analytics, and the need to understand how to connect the dots, and that's what you did. That's what you did, rather, on this notion of employee listening, because there's so many ways, not only to listen, but to package information so it can go to decision makers in a way that they're not only understand, but it's confidence inspiring. So they know that they're making decisions based on the best insight that's available. So if you would introduce yourself and a little bit about the article and what you're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, thank you, Al. I really appreciate that too. It's always kind of a work in progress to put something out there, and there's a lot more thoughts that are going on. And just as we're talking about this today too, I want to make sure it's a conversation with the audience, folk out there. As you're seeing this, as you're thinking about it, please make sure you're getting back to me because I would love to keep evolving this as we kind of continue the conversation. But let me back up a step. I'm Richard. I've been in the people analytics space for about a decade. Had a nonprofit career before that. Found my way over here. Absolutely in love with the field. Love what I get up to over here. I've been a practitioner for a long time, so got to really kind of see what it looked like kind of on the ground, worked with teams, led teams, and recently found my way over to One Model. So One Model, we're a people analytics company. We have a people data platform called the People Data Cloud. And the People Data Cloud is all of your workforce information, where you need it, when you need it, organized and ready to go. And so we'd love to talk about that too. But today we're gonna chat about the three channels of workforce information.
Well, here, I'm going to bring it up just because I like playing with toys. And again, I was really taken by not only the thinking behind it, but the simplicity in the model, which I know you're going to talk about. And so everyone knows, if you go to Richard's feed, you can find it, but you can also find it here as well. So, with that, I'm going to hide this and let you get at it. So, Richard, you want to take the floor, and you're going to present for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back and talk about it. So I'll facilitate that discussion. So again, just to echo what Richard shared, if you have questions, put them in the comments there on LinkedIn or whatever platform you're viewing this on, and then we'll talk about it. So Richard, take it away, sir.
Thank you, Al. Yeah, I really appreciate the comment on simplicity too, because like a lot of what I get up to in the space as I'm thinking about it and chewing on things and thinking through things, it's something confusing is going on, and I want to get to the bottom of it. I've just got a real urge to kind of dig in, feel it out, see if something else is going on here, and I think it's why I love being in people analytics too. As a relatively new field of work, we have a lot of those questions. We're doing things, we're figuring out why we're doing them, we're getting back to first principles, and it's an exciting time to be here. So I think anyone that's thinking about kind of you're seeing something that's confusing or maybe doesn't make sense to you, I would just always recommend go pull on that thread, see what's going on, and I've had a lot of fun doing that, and I hope you will too. But yeah, I'd like to talk to you today about the three channels of workforce information. This is something I've been chewing on for a long time and thinking through, and in particular, get my slides going here. There's this quote, and I love this quote for so many reasons. This quote is from Margaret Mead. It's what people say, what people do, and what people say they do are entirely different things. I feel like if I wrote a book about people analytics, this is the first quote on the first page. Because this is one that to me really sums up why this field is so hard. And I think it's why HR is hard too. And it's something that I think HR people like give yourself some credit. We're working with humans. Humans are wild. It's incredibly complex. This isn't the ones and zeros. This isn't the dollars. This is a human we're trying to understand, work with, work around, and just when you go from person to people, all the problems just explode outwards too. So it's a tough subject area. And I think this quote really articulates it because you can hear somebody, you can watch them, and you can ask them what they did, and you come up with different results. And it's not necessarily that they're lying to you. It's that they might not know themselves that well, or they might not have been paying attention to what they were doing, or they've got high ambitions about what they want to do in the future. And so this idea about like how do we even analyze a person, I think this quote really jumps off the page to me. So it's something I've thought about for years, and I talk about this one a lot. I share this one a lot. And I think it was that like repetition of saying it and working through it. I'm like, hey, I think there's something else deeper here. And maybe I've just got my blinders on and I'm just going real deep into this, but I think I came up with something that I'd love to share with you all. And so as we're thinking about this, I think there's something here around how we scale what we do in people analytics and how we think about people analytics, as well as how we scale what we do in employee listening and what we do around employee listening. So let me take it a little further. I want to introduce a term called information channels. And this is a term that I think is going to become increasingly important in HR and in business as we shift to understand where our data comes from. And so an information channel is a source that generates data or information. This is a place that generates information that then flows downstream into our kind of systems and understanding and analytics or how we understand the world, but it's a generator of that. And so if we think about some examples of that, and I'm going to read off the page so I don't get them wrong here, we need to start a new information channel to measure this outcome properly. You might say that if you don't really have the data you need, but you've got to generate new information from somewhere. Or we tapped the HRBP information channel to learn more about employee feelings towards return to office. Just sort of introducing that too, where some of these information channels are not necessarily data and technology. There are a lot of different ways we learn about the world around us, but it's how do we gather information about the workforce? So let me bring us back in. I want to talk about 3 specific channels today, which tie us back to that quote. I see first what people say. To me, this is the conversation channel. And this is the oldest one we have. Even today, as you're listening to this, this is me having a conversation. I'm sending you data. We're doing it in an incredibly complicated way compared to our ancestors through the screens, through the different things that are going on the internet. But it's a human to human. I've got data. I want to send you some information. You're gathering it. You're understanding it. In the workplace, I see this happening in kind of 3 major ways. We've got sort of our formal channels. And this is something like we have regular check-ins, we have regular one-on-ones. I see then too, we have our informal channels. These are places like the water cooler. I hope that the water cooler as an example stays, even though we all are remote in different ways and water coolers are not necessarily something that exists today. But this idea of that water cooler chat where it's, hey, this is an informal conversation. I'm just catching up about work, catching up about something, but learning about the culture and the organization. This last one's a little ambitious, but I want to throw it out there, which is this idea of the ethnographic conversation. The ethnographic is really tapping into those like anthropological understanding of the world. How do we learn through observation and immersion and getting that cultural understanding? When I think about this channel, this is one that as people analytics professionals, we've sort of recoiled from in the past, I would say, decade. Because really by nature, we're a data channel. We're about data and we're about kind of the concreteness of that. But when I think about the real value of the conversation channel, I see richness of data and I see density and I see cultural context and all of those nuances. Even me over here flailing my hands around, I'm sending extra information about how I'm feeling, what I'm doing, the body language components of it. And you can learn so much more about humans in those kind of conversational channels. And I think the group that really represents this channel best is our business partners, whether that's HRBPs, whether that's recruiters, whether that's the managers, almost like a supply chain that reaches out to the workforce and pulls information back to make sense of it. I'm going to push forward a little bit more, and we'll talk more about this one. But the next one, really tap into Margaret's quote again, Professor Mead. Maybe I'm not on first name basis with Margaret, but Professor Mead, what people say they do. What people say they do, I see this as surveys. And when I say surveys, I actually mean that in almost like an abstract version of a survey. Because I think when I think about surveys, I need to capture novel information that's not in a system, that's not in a conversation, but I want to capture it at scale. And I want to bring that information back to Central where we can make sense of it. So a lot of times what comes to mind are the Qualtrics of the world, the Survey Monkeys, the systems that we can actually create a survey or a pulse survey, engagement survey, and actually send that out to gather information back. But I also want to broaden this a little bit to think about the other channels around things like performance reviews. So a performance review is I send out a form, I gather information, I pull that form back, and we use that to help us make decisions about the workforce. So when we think about all of these forms and ways we collect information, this is a channel that's about, it's not just a conversation, we're collecting it using a mechanism, and we're pulling it back at scale. When I think about the last one there too, kind of speaking to those kind of psychometric, I think that's really speaking about like, how do we survey to understand what people feel in the workplace? Because if you think about what people feel, we don't have a thermometer that gets engagement. We get a survey that has people tell us what they think they're feeling about the engagement in the workplace. And so just thinking about like the mechanisms there, we have these mechanisms to pull back that psychometric information to understand our workforce. Let me push forward a little bit more too. So this last one, what people do, and I've reorganized them a little bit from the quote just to kind of flow down here. But what people do, I see this as our systems. And this is something that in the grand history of work, relatively new, kind of coming up with that kind of employee engagement systems and HR tech systems, as we've started to document and engage with these technologies at work, we're leaving behind that trail of information about who we are, what we did, what we do, how we think about things. And it's a way to kind of tap into that passive system data and we pull that out. this is a place where you typically see like the traditional people analytics team play, or the first people analytics team play. That's where the people analytics team comes in, and we have this mountain of data in our HRIS, in our ATS, in our different systems from recruiting and HR and L&D and comp. How do we mine that, understand that, and make sense of that information to listen and learn about the workforce? When I think about this too, this is not only the HR tech systems, this could be our work tech systems, things like badging or accounting systems or payroll, kind of or I guess payroll is kind of across there, but thinking about the kind of non-traditional HR systems where we can learn about the workforce. And then lastly, these collaboration tech systems like the Worklytics of the world that can go in and understand your Slack network, understand your Google Calendars, pull that information back and turn that into information. So I'm throwing a lot out here, but if we think about this quote and think about these areas, my feeling is we're getting to actually a bit of a distinct set of different tools that traditionally had very different users. So really with that conversations piece, that was really traditionally like the HRBPs or the business partners lived there and they understood the cultural context. You might have an employee listening team that kind of tackles the survey, maybe talent management. And then sort of the people analytics team, or maybe in a business team that looks at the kind of HR tech, work tech, and collaboration systems. And when I started seeing that, I'm like, okay, if we convert this back to information, I think we can actually tie these together. And by tying them together, I think we can learn more about what they are. So let me push forward here. So this one's a bit of a busy slide, but I want to talk you through it. We've got our kind of three channels on the left. We've got our conversations, our surveys, and our systems. We've got our, a little too fast there. We've got our information channels, our acting space, and then the outcomes we're going after. When I think about the information channels, we have where the information is generated, and then how it's interpreted, and how it's turned back into information. And by doing this, this is a very like linguistic form of algebra here. I want to get everything converted to the same thing. Because when we get it converted to the same thing, we can start to see this framework where the goal here is actually generating information. But then that information from across the board has to be brought in to synthesize, analyze, understand. But that's not the end of it. The next step there is really that drives a story, which drives decisions, which drives business results. And I've got in here too, kind of your talent strategy also influences there, the experiences you have influence there, but really talking about this flow from information to story, or information to analysis to story to decision. That's a really important flow for everything we get up to in HR. It's not just a people analytics thing. One of the big takeaways I have here is as a people analytics field, we've sort of named ourselves after the methodology. And I don't want to touch the third rail of name. Like people analytics, great brand, great name, let's stick with it. But when we think about what that means, that methodology is a little limiting when we look at this framework. And the reality is when we start to think about people analytics less as I work with systems data and more as I'm a decision support function, suddenly these other channels start to light up. I think the other thing as I started looking at this, I have sort of backed into mixed methods. So this is kind of a second discoverer kind of backing into why mixed methods is important. But I think it's a little bit different talking about the information that's generated and how it flows through. But to me, just emphasizes mixed methods in a different way. We've got to be pulling in each of these channels for different reasons and different times to make sense of the world and then drive to decisions. The other reason I've been looking at this framework a lot and thinking through this framework is it actually starts to lay out a bit of an HR tech landscape where you start to see players that traditionally were very different spaces actually are in the same business of listening. So we see things like kind of the Qualtrics of the world. One model, we do a lot of that kind of extraction from direct systems. Again, those kind of worklytics. I think the conversation space is one that's a little underrated and one we don't hear quite as much about, but companies like Receptivity, companies like Erudit, they've started to do this kind of like observational understanding of the workforce and turning that into cultural metrics or cultural information that then is easy to blend with the rest of what you do. And so when we start to look at this, I think that's another use case for this. One is how do we work together and why do we work together? I think two, there's this technology landscape view of this where you can start to plot players in different spaces. I think, again, from that one model space, as we're looking at this and as we're looking at the future of the company, I really see us in this workforce information space. So being that central layer, because we do pull in information from collaborative systems, we do pull in work tech information, we do pull in surveys and get that into one spot to help with that synthesis and analysis. So it's also something that's helping us as we're thinking about where do we go, how do our products work, and how do we talk to our customers about what we do. Let me drive a little forward here into some kind of core takeaways, I think. I've talked about this a little bit already, but conversations, survey, and systems are each valid ways to listen. This is an old debate, I think, within people analytics, where it's kind of like the HRBPs don't understand, and the HRBPs say, "Hey, that data team doesn't understand. We've got to go our own ways." And the reality is, it's, hey, we're looking at the same thing from different angles, and we're seeing the workforce from our different perspectives. And as we do that, we gain a better understanding of the workforce and a three-dimensional understanding of the workforce that each of us can't get from our own perspective. So when I talk to people analytics teams about this, I say, "Hey, from data alone, you're rarely going to actually make change. You've got to pull in that anecdotal side. You've got to pull in that ethnographic side. And you've got to pull in those anecdotes sometimes too to really hammer home points to actually get to decisions, because decisions are the end goal." I talked about this one, but just to answer it again, analytics is a methodology, it's not a purpose. And I think this also gets some people analytics teams into hot water when they start talking about themselves as just a data team or just an analytics team. You start looking a lot like a central IT team. And the reality is, HR needs decision support. We make so many decisions about the workforce, and the workforce is so critical that having a decision support function is unbelievable. Like, it's hard to think back to the time before where this just wasn't an option, but having a group that can help us make better decisions centrally, that is firmly part of HR. And so when I think about how we frame ourselves and how we articulate our missions, leaning into that purpose around this and leaning into these different channels and embracing them is critical for the future of people analytics. Lastly, and this is an important one, I think, for my HR listeners that are out there, as well as the people analytics teams, I've started using this framework to help introduce HR folk to the field. And one of the things I've really leaned into is HRBPs are really good at listening. That whole conversation channel, and just from talking to HRBPs, learning about them, seeing what they do, and just being an HRBP in my past, HRBPs almost live in the flow of the culture of the teams when they're really at their best. That to me is something that we can lean into when we say, okay, HRBPs, you're good at listening. You're really good at conversations. Let's take that to the survey side. Thinking about the survey side, you're good at surveys too. And I think a lot of HR teams in general, they embrace, they understand the surveys that employ listening. Where they get afraid is like the math and stats and the science of people analytics. When we can start to frame people analytics as listening at scale, and in this framework, we have a way to do that. We can say, hey, every piece of data you see, there's a person hiding behind there. We can listen through data. Come with us. Let's come over here together and let's go at this together. I found that's a really helpful way to bring HRBPs into the fold. So I'd love to hear from people afterwards too, if that's something that they can take with them and that's something they could do within their organizations. I've got one more slide, and then I'll open up to questions here. This is another one that I've just been chewing on. It's a bit of a surprise to Al too, because we didn't talk about this. This isn't in the article, but it's something that I think a lot about, which is, why is information flow so important to companies in general, but to HR tech? The modern software system looks like this. This is the most basic version of a modern software system. You have information flows in, you have a data model, a data foundation, and the information flows out. And then from that central data model, you can rebuild any applications. This is something in conversations with John Sumser a lot. So just to make sure I'm kind of crediting back the idea there, this idea of we can rebuild whatever software we need if we have the data we have. So when I think about this, and this is a bit maybe a controversial piece, but I think generative AI is coming for that application layer. And you wouldn't expect to get through a conversation or any webinar without hearing the words generative AI nowadays. So I'm going to bring it in just at the end here. But this idea is, as we think about how we consume media is changing, I can take a news article and I can say, hey, I want that written in the form of Shakespeare now. Or I'll take that news article and say, hey, I want that as a video instead. We're going to see the front end of a lot of applications start to be generated. And we're going to see that front end visualization layers start to be more personalized and customized based on how they're generated. So when I think about the core fundamental of what it's going to be in the future, as we look at this space, this data foundation is going to become ever more important, because if you don't have the data, you don't get to generate anything from there. So I'll leave it at that, just to kind of hammer home why this information view is so important as we head into this world of generative AI. Okay, Al, I went a little bit longer, but I pulled this one up here. This is just kind of a placeholder for kind of, if you'd like to learn more, I'm over at onemodel.co/blog. I've got my inspiration in the middle, Professor Margaret Mead, tremendous voice in anthropology. And then we've got a QR code over here on the side if you just like to snag the blog right away. But thank you all for listening today. And Al, I'm not sure where you're gone, but it'd be great to see you again.
I'm here, my friend. I am here. Hey, thank you for sharing. And I had tons of questions. And again, if you're listening, viewing, if you have questions or comments, by all means, share. But first off, congratulations on thinking this through in the way that you did and writing the article. If you have not seen it, it's certainly worth the read. It's just this size, all due respect. And in other words, it's a longer
I have
article.
gotten that. It's a little long. Like
No,
puppies down with
but
it.
I say that intentionally to set expectations with those who view it because it's really well thought through.
Thank you.
And one of the things that I just want to call out that when I was in role 20 years ago now, which scares me, uh, I caught on to what you're saying about people analytics being a process, a methodology, as opposed to highlighting our value. So we rebranded ourselves internally, Employee Insights, to mirror what was happening in marketing with consumer insights. So again, I just want to amplify that because those our turtle customers, our internal customers, HR executives and others, they could give a rat's tail on what's happening underneath it. They just want the insight that they need at the time that they need it. So, fast forward, here we are, oftentimes stuck in the methodology, and we're losing sight of the purpose. So you actually bring to light the purpose, because that's in the 20 years plus that I've been in the field, that last mile has been the most difficult aspect in my view. So this lands in a question for you. Who is the odds framework? Because it's that people analytics team, our executives, because as we look at the future of work in this age of perpetual disruption with AI, robotic automation, outsourcing, gig economy, all these aspects, the means in which we're sizing the organization, creating culture, designing how work actually gets done is shifting. And to envision the future of an organization without appropriate insight, I would go so far to say it's just outright irresponsible. So I look at this framework and go, that's really freaking cool. Who's going to actually consume it and take appropriate action in terms of applying the appropriate governance, decision-making processes and all that? Your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Alan. I'd say one, keep an eye on onemodel.co/blog because we're going to have more coming out about this. And again, that's sort of like we've got the foundation. Let's rebuild all the different applications we need to do from here. I think when I think about anytime I write, my background, my basis, my authorship has always been around the people analytics function and writing to people analytics leaders. For this particular one, I did try to generalize this. So I tried to make this a little bit more open, a little bit more agnostic to people analytics, which I think added some length there too. But the goal was that this is something that a people analytics leader might see and say, hey, that framework makes sense. And I want to kind of talk about this within my company. And I wanted to write in a way that would also appeal to the talent leaders who may be overseeing the employee listening program. Write in a way that the head of HRBPs could take a look at it and say, hey, that's actually a way that brings me in a way that's welcoming to me, to the framework. And so I think this core one, probably a little bit more reference, but then what we're planning to do is kind of build up from there. And so we'll see kind of as we go through the next couple of weeks and months, you'll see some other kind of views and frameworks kind of tying back to this one. And the goal is to kind of allow for some other entrance points in from there. But it's a great question, Al. I think you're probably going to see a little bit more technical teams just as we get into this like wireframe frameworks. That's just where I live and where my historical audiences have lived. But
Right.
looking forward to more variations in the future too.
Yeah, Brian, I see your question, and we're going to get to that in a second. But before, I want to bring up Scott's question here, and you can read the details, Richard. But the
Yeah.
essence of it is build versus buy. And I had a conversation with Ben Weber a couple of days ago. No, that was yesterday. And we talk about the likelihood that people analytics teams are going to be outsourced to a greater degree. And so the idea of buying a lot of what you describe in that value chain, might be evolving, but not to bias your response. But what are your thoughts on the
Yeah.
build versus buy, not only technologically, but in terms of the people actually doing the work?
Yeah, Scott, it's a great question. Thank you for asking too. I'm of a couple minds on this one. I think first, in the long run, my theory is the vendors win. Whatever system we're talking about, like one of the questions I talk about a lot is, have you considered building your own payroll system? It would be wild to try to build a payroll system from scratch. And like any IT leader that's like, you know what, I can do it better than the payroll systems that are out there. I'm going after it. You sit them down and talk them through what's going on there. Because over the long run there, payroll being kind of our first HR tech has become this very much so. The vendors have that. It's a great thing that they do because they see all the problems across all of the different customers they have. They're able to build centrally. They're able to evolve. They're able to attract different talent to make that happen. So I think there's a little bit of this we're starting to see within the people analytics space. The vendor community is very strong. I am biased here, and so full disclosure, one model people analytics platform. But having been a customer a couple times, that's what drew me over here, and kind of the strength of the build that one model does. I think the other mind that I have on this though is we see this a lot as a dichotomy between build versus buy. And the reality is that there's a middle ground. There's a build plus, which is, hey, let's go get a platform and let's build on top of that platform. And that's something we're exploring and working with over here at One Model, which is we create the tools, we create the spaces where people can build, but we know that we're not going to be able to automate and prescribe to you what your company is and what your company's challenges are. So build plus in this space is a little bit more of, hey, you've got your unique things. We need to make sure we bring those in. You've got your unique things you want to go after too. Let's make sure we let you do those. But you don't have to go alone. I think that's the real selling point around build plus. So I think there's somewhere in the middle here, and we're reaching a new era of this people analytics space where 15 years ago, you had to just build. That was it. If you were going to be a team of any size, if you were going to scale what you're doing, build was the option. I think we're starting to enter this space where the vendors have it, and maybe a little biased on that front too, but that's
No,
where I'm at on it.
hey, you're talking to someone who is biased. I mean, not only have we been drinking the Kool-Aid, we've been making the Kool-Aid for a long
Yeah.
time. So, if we're not going to be advocates of it, nobody going to be advocates for what you're saying. So thank you for sharing. Few more questions. Just for planning purposes, we will go past the bottom of the hour, at least for a bit. And I'm going to bring up this again to paraphrase those three listening channels. What does the team makeup look like? And both with inside an organization and to the discussion that we just had, is there room for partnerships to help build this capability?
Yeah, I think
Thanks, Kyle.
anybody trying to do them. Yeah, and it was that Kyle. Thank you, Kyle.
Yeah.
Um, Anybody trying to do this alone will run into trouble because essentially we're talking about how do we listen to the workforce as a whole. I'm not sure that that's a single centralized unit or if that's a decentralized approach with a centralized team supporting and kind of thinking about that. But this idea of like it's got to come back together somewhere, and you've got to be thinking about how you pull from each of these spots. I think we've seen two approaches which I kind of fit into this framework. We haven't talked to him about this yet, so this is hot off the presses kind of thinking about this. But we see people analytics teams with analytics business partners, and we see HRBP organizations driving towards data informed HR. And those two frameworks, I think, are really getting to the spot in the middle that brings conversations, surveys, and systems data into a single point where storytelling then becomes the important factor. So I think we're seeing it a little bit with how those two different groups are framing and forming. And maybe they just haven't melded yet into the future super role, whatever that might be. Or maybe it needs a little bit more technology support there too. But that's kind of the thinking around kind of how you'd pull that together. In terms of partnerships, I think that's something too. When we think about one model, like we lean into our partners heavily. We find ways to work within a partner ecosystem because at the end of the day, one company thinking it can do it all, I think we've seen a lot of those rise and fall over the years. And so this idea of making sure you know what you do and know what you do well, but then having someone that can pull it all together, that's where one model's position, that we can pull a lot of these different data streams together. We can bring conversations into the storyboards. We can bring surveys and Qualtrics into the back end, and we can start to blend those data sets. I think that's where we'll see tech play, and that's where one model plays today. And then paired up with that AVP or HRVP of the future as they've started to form into their roles.
Yeah, and this next question actually is a segue off what you just shared because we're talking about teams and human beings doing the work, but obviously machines are going to be doing
Yeah.
the work. And Tushar highlights, the emergence, and to your last, the role of generative AI in all this and the use of large language models, which we can have a whole session about that. But your thoughts on the evolution of generative AI in facilitating the analysis and distribution or access of the insight that a larger audience can take action from. Thanks, Tushar.
Yeah. Thank you, Tushar. Yeah, I wish I had a citation for this, but I saw someone talking the other day about could generative AI be used to replace humans in psychological studies? Because generative AI responds emotionally with, it was like 95% similar to humans. And again, I'm going to butcher that a little bit. We'll see if we can track it down and we'll throw it in the show notes. But this idea of could IO psychology of the future, start to question a generative AI that was performing as a person within the organization and send them 1,000 questions instead of like a person would get pretty bugged if you sent them 1,000 questions. So I think this idea, and I've heard it called kind of digital twinning. This idea of it kind of came out of that. Alan Kamen and I were chatting about this around digital twinning with GE and manufacturing, where you'd have your airplane engine and you'd have the digital twin of the airplane engine and be able to understand those two things through each other. I could see a future workforce where we digital twin the workforce to better understand, but then also protect employees. Because when you have those digital twin workforces, you can do things like uh, anonymize differently and do more generative kind of pieces to kind of scrub and clean and jitter the data. So I think there's an interesting play there. I think the piece I keep coming back to though is the future of these generative, with especially with an HR tech, belongs to the company that generates the best data, because we still haven't begun to understand humans. Like it's pretty high level. Like all things considered, all my HR tech friends, you're doing a great job. You're doing the best you can. Humans are so deep, and the complex systems of what a human is, to be able to kind of pull that into a system to make sense of it, we are just scratching the surface. And so I think as we go down this path of generative and we understand the limitations of the data we have, we're going to see teams start to reach further and start to find new ways to think about capturing really that three-dimensional human and bring them into the system so we can start to understand them better in the future. So a nice kind of push and pull there between that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'll just highlight one thing as we start to wrap here. And I'm going to get back to Brian Hackett's questions about driving this insight and aligning it and showing that it's actually has a benefit to business performance. The one thing that I'm anguishing over, and the reason I'm fumbling with my words right now, is I feel a high level of disappointment in how many organizations have responded to the downturn in the
Mm.
economy. And a lot of the layoffs have been financially driven. And what I mean by that is that there's been a gross ignorance of the social capital, the human capital embedded within those human beings. And obviously, there's moral and ethical things that can be considered, and there's societal decisions that have to be made regarding how we move forward with AI being so disruptive. But the key theme is, if we were doing this based on the insight that you're talking about, we would have not only the better insight, but it would inform,
Yeah.
hey, this person is actually critical to our strategy. They have this relationship capital that's critical. Yet many organizations, and I can only point to a handful, have actually look at that skills-based data, look at that social capital data, and said, hey, we're going to have that inform how we right-size the workforce moving forward. So your thoughts on
Yeah.
our opportunity with the framework that you're introducing, as just in general for people analytics, to do better at elevating our insight, engaging our internal customers in more meaningful ways, so we can actually be wiser, both organizationally and at the team level and as individuals. Your thoughts?
Yeah. This is what I get pretty fired up about this too, Al. I think when we think about this, like this past year of change that's happened, like COVID years aside, I think we can pass those, which is kind of a nice thing. But the idea of like this past round, the finance tools were stronger than the HR tools, and the finance voice was louder than the HR voice. And maybe it needed to be. Maybe there's a world where the economy is changing, things are different, and there's parts of that. But I think what happened was finance kind of grabbed the wheel and made a left turn, and we had to let it happen this time because we didn't have what we needed to speak up. And so I think as I'm looking at going forward here, when I talk to HR teams, I think we're past the moment where HR should be begging for data. HR should be demanding equity with their partners. HR is a part of the business. We are a full function. We manage at times 70% of the cost of the business in terms of like the workforce. There is no, just any HR leaders out there, there is no reason you should be asked to justify why you're using data to manage your business. And I think that's something I get pretty fired up about nowadays. And I'm starting to lean into a little bit more because we're past that. Let's get to the point where this is an expectation, because the rest of the functions have that. They don't get questions about data. You need to run data for marketing, for finance, for other parts of the business. HR, it's like we're there. So let's set the bar at we run the business with data, and let's go forward together. And this next time around, when that next recession happens, which we know it does, it's every 7 years. I mean, this is pretty standard at this point. That next round, let's be ready for it. And I think that is getting this listening framework in place. Let's make sure we understand what's going on in the workforce. So when we come to the table, we come to the table ready to fight.
Well, Richard, thank you for that response. That we need to your point, generate more energy, and we need to create the space for HR leaders and others who are on this journey to move. And your framework actually creates that space to do it. I think it's a great discussion starter. I think it's going to have some legs, and I'll do my part to trumpet it and get it out there. So thank
I
you for
appreciate the
sharing.
call.
Thank you all who participated today. I appreciate your questions and engagement, and stay tuned. There's more to come on this front as we wrap. Richard, how can people follow you, learn more about what you're up to there at One Model?
Yeah, definitely. OneModel.co/blog. That's where all of my brilliant colleagues, there's a ton of phenomenal stuff coming out from One Model. I mean, we've got decades of experience in this space. You'll find all kinds of cool things there. I blog on there too. And then please find me on LinkedIn, Richard Rosenow. LinkedIn in Richard Rosenow, that's me. And I'm sure if you're watching this on LinkedIn, there's some links right there. But Al, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. Just great to connect as a friend. Great to hear what you're doing. And just thrilled to be here today.
Well, again, thanks for sharing. Thanks for being your awesome self, and we'll talk soon. All right.
Sounds
Be
good.
well. Thanks again.
Bye, everybody.